Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, we'll be taking a look at the latest science that shows us that we're burning up this planet. And we'll talk about what we can do to stop it. Republican state leaders, well, they're taking the page right out of Enron's playbook and looking to loot the public employee pension programs. We'll bring you the details on that story. And the Democratic Party is suffering from a severe lack of young leadership. We'll find out what's being done to recruit young faces to the party. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, just remember, you just stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
The UN just released the 5th IPCC report, and they made it clear that human beings are burning down this planet. It's time for the government to act. I'm joined now by Ring of Fire co-host Sam Seder to talk about that report and what needs to be done. Sam, the 5th IPCC report is out. What I think is most interesting about this is every time they've done a report, they've moved closer to the conclusion that man is responsible for it. This one, I don't think, is even equivocal about it. What's your take?
You're right, Pap. I mean, this, like you say, this is the 5th report. It comes out every 5 years. The last one we saw was back in 2007. And back in 2007, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said at that time that it was very likely that global warming was due to human activity, and now they have essentially upgraded that, or if you want, downgraded that, depending on your perspective, to extremely likely. So they're now at the point where very likely was basically saying there's a 10% chance that we're wrong here. Now they are basically up to 5%. And the thing about this, Pap, that I hope people understand is that these reports tend to be on the conservative side.
Right.
They have to have them signed off by 195 countries. They have to have them signed off by hundreds of scientists. And so they find the least common denominator, the one that they're most sure about, the one that there's no equivocation on. And so when you're talking about a 95% likelihood that this is caused by man-made activities, then there really is no further argument to be made.
Sam, what's troubling about this is the last couple of reports is what I guess I've heard it called the twofold load, and that is where this warming is a process that then releases methane into the atmosphere. In other words, it's one thing for us to release carbon dioxide into the air, but when you have methane in the soil, when you have methane under the sea, when you have methane that's fairly ubiquitous in everywhere around us, when it heats up, it then releases into the environment. It even has a much worse impact on the process of global warming. What's your take on that? That concerned me more than anything about this report.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing that they've come to understand over the course of the 30-odd years that they have been releasing this report, is that there's a feedback loop, that the more global warming you have, the more CO2 that you have in the atmosphere, the more it warms the surface of the planet, the more you see ice caps melting, sea levels rising. And as those ice caps melt, like you say, it releases more methane, and that exponentially speeds up the process. And so that's one of the things that has come out over the years, is that makes the sort of the projections and the computer models saying just how much time we have left to I don't know that we can reverse this process, but we can certainly stem its tide in some respects.
Well, we're at 400 parts per million right now. 350 was a questionable number, and with the methane load that follows all of this, it could reach 10. Of course, that's catastrophic. 6 is catastrophic. I mean, there's no question. We've seen the cycle several times in the history of the world. Where they've been extinction events, and that's where we're headed to if you take what they say and extrapolate what other scientists are saying about the potential end result here.
That's right. And, it's not just a question of, of extinction. We're not going to see the end of humanity. What we're going to see is the end of a large chunk of humanity by the end of the century. And we're going to see continuing social upheaval because of it. There was a lot of people who sort of glossed over the fact that what we see in Syria, where we have this civil war that's taking place that nearly brought in the superpowers as well, is a function of global warming. It is a function of the droughts and the implications for growing food. And then when you have millions of people who are without food resources, when they don't have the ability to do this, the government starts to make decisions that also heighten the economic problems in that country. And you can almost tie most of the upheavals that we've seen around the Middle East in some respects to economic issues. And certainly these are enhanced, if not actually started in many respects, by what we see with the weather.
Sam, a story that you and I covered, it was years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we covered the story where the information had leaked from the Pentagon. It didn't come out into the public domain because the Pentagon wanted it out there. But it was put in the public domain where it said that the Pentagon is already planning how do you deal with the social upheaval that surrounds global climate change that we're seeing right now. And it's very specific. Even back then they were talking about we're going to have problems in North, South Africa, we're going to have problems in Middle East, we're going to have problems in South America. The Maldives are disappearing, Bangladesh is already underwater. And so then the question becomes, how on that kind of scale, how do you really solve anything meaningfully? And that's what this IPCC report, that's why it should scare the hell out of anybody who takes the time to read it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, the Pentagon sees global warming as the #1 security threat for this nation as we go forward. And this also doesn't even include the notion of, what happens when we start having a Hurricane Sandy or a Superstorm Sandy every other year or every year. You're talking about billions upon billions upon billions of dollars to rebuild American cities, to rebuild American communities. What's going to happen 30 years from now when Miami is underwater? And we're talking about stretching our resources thin on just simply maintaining the existence of certain cities in this country.
Yeah, Sam, I just think it's so interesting when we take stories that you and I have done over the years and we juxtapose it with this IPCC report. One thing that a story I recall us doing that is becoming more and more out there, people are now discovering that you had the biggest insurance companies in the world, the Lloyds of London types, saying that we have to adapt to global warming because it's real. Now, when did they start doing it? We found out they started doing it 10 years ago, during the time that the industry was still pumping money into trying to create this idea there is no such thing as global climate change. You had the biggest PR firms in the world, people like Ogilvy, who's kind of the go-to goon squad for every ugly issue in the world. They were trying to convince the American public there's no problem here. But it's come to pass now. It's coming to roost, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And, there's almost like, when you see these industries, they're playing both sides of this, right? I mean, on one hand, you've got the Koch brothers who stand to gain from all of the carbon that they're pumping and that they're burning and that they're selling. And at the same time, they're also, you see the big money also prepping for the implications of this. So on one hand, they deny it, so they're able to continue to essentially poison our atmosphere. And then on the other hand, they're prepping to actually reap the benefits from this. I mean, look, one of the things that we're going to see is we're going to start to see more petroleum products that are having to be used because we need better growing practices, and so you're going to see them using more and more things like potash and fertilizer, so that we can take what is now, because of global warming, arid farmland and make it more productive. I mean, so
well, you're going to see it for cooling and heating. I mean, people misunderstand this concept of global warming. I mean, it's global climate change. You know,
Right.
they'll have a ridiculously cold winter and they'll say, what is this about global warming? Well, they don't understand that's part of it. And the heating bills go up. And during the summer, the cooling bills go up. The energy drain becomes exponentially pushed. And as we're looking at this, even as we speak, you have the industry trying to figure out how they can make more money on this. They're going to the Arctic to try to drill the oil that was underneath the Arctic shelf and underneath to where they can make money on the final destruction of the planet. They're talking, Sam, about the idea of how wonderful it is that they now have new routes that they can take for shipping and cut off time around South America because they can simply go across the top of the globe. It's amazing the caliber of greed that continues to surface here, isn't it?
yeah, and I think that's indicative of the problem that we have. These corporations, they see one thing only, and that is their own private profit. And at any given time, that means that they will socialize the cost to the rest of society, and that is the rest of us. So they are making money off of the destruction of the planet. They are making money now off the destruction of the planet. They are then using the destruction of the planet as an opportunity to make even more money. That's simply what they do. And in the meantime, they are, like you said, they are spending millions upon millions, billions of dollars on essentially biostitutes who are out there saying, you know, this is not, we still don't know for sure.
Yeah, we need more information.
Yeah, and by the time that we know for sure, according to these people, we'll be looking in our rearview mirror and their practices will no longer be being used because they'll have moved on to new practices that they're using to make money. And
Sam, isn't it time to become more militant about this? I mean, if we have children, we have grandchildren, we have families that we want to protect well beyond the time we're gone. Bill McKibben says it's time to become more militant. In about 30 seconds, what is your take on it? I mean, how do we become more militant in stopping this? What do we do?
Well, I think people have to just simply stand up and make sure that they are counted. And, you know, right now we know that about 50,000 people have signed on to a pledge. I think that Credo Action was putting out there saying that in the event that the State Department signs off on Keystone XL, they're pledging to get arrested. And so you're talking about mass civil disobedience.
How about drying up the money for these companies, like in universities and municipalities, and simply do not
Divestiture is
allow
very important. It was helpful in South Africa, and I think it will be helpful here. But people have to get actively involved in this struggle.
where we don't invest into their pensions, we don't invest into their greed. We have to begin there, don't we? Sam Seder, this is a story. It just continues getting uglier almost every year.
Sadly, yeah.
We've been covering this story for many years, and it seems to get uglier every year. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Pap. Always a pleasure.
Coming up, we'll find out why state legislators are stealing money from public employee pensions and getting away with it. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. When Enron fell more than a decade ago, the public was shocked to find out that the company had been stealing money from the employees' pension programs. The same scenario is now playing itself out in the states across this country. I have author and journalist David Sirota here to tell us what's happening. David, it used to be that government workers were willing to make a trade-off. They were willing to take lower wages in exchange for a little bit of security when they retired. That is pension programs and the ability to kind of live those golden years with that type of security. What's happening is the erosion of that security that's taking place all over the country right now, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing is a 50-state plan to try to cut guaranteed retirement income. And I use that phrase specifically because what so-called pension reformers are pushing is to eliminate the guarantee. They're pushing to replace traditional defined benefit pension plans which guarantee retirees a certain income. They're trying to replace those with things like 401k style accounts, with something called a cash balance pension, which basically takes away the guarantee of that income. And that is a violation of, as you allude to, the sacred promise that was made to those workers. And it really is sacred. When a worker 20, 25, 30 years ago says, listen, I'm willing to forsake higher wages right now for that guaranteed retirement income later, 20, 25, 30 years later to then say, well, we, the employer, are going to renege on that commitment. That is a violation of something sacred, because it's not like the worker can suddenly have those 30 years back to make sure that they've made a different decision. It's really a total bait and switch, and it's immoral.
Well, interesting, this article that you wrote, The Plot to Loot Workers' Pensions, I thought was just really well done as usual. And I thought the thing that struck me about it was that you had the Pew Foundation coming in and saying what we're saying is completely accurate, that there is an erosion of pension programs that runs the risk of destroying these people's lives in the very time that they need this money. There are no alternatives. They're not going to be able to even live on the money that they have in most of these pensions because they've already been raided. Then you add to that the story that we see coming out of Detroit, where it was the intent of the governor to say, well, we're going to get at the pension programs by declaring bankruptcy, and we're not going to have responsibility to pay these pension programs. That is kind of the formula that we started seeing in private industry. We saw it with Eastern Airlines. They were the first ones to use it, and it worked very, very well for Eastern Airlines. All these people were out of a pension program all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a scheme, a calculated scheme. Here's what's been going on. States, as the employer of public workers, have not been meeting their obligations to fund those pensions. And people understand this. If you're an employer in a private sector job, you may have a 401k, you may have a pension. Your employer is putting in money, and you're putting in money. So when the state doesn't put in its money, it's as if you're a private sector worker, your employer just said, all right, we're not going to fund what we're contractually obligated to fund for your retirement. So that's created a shortfall. Also, what's created a shortfall is the shenanigans on Wall Street, which tanked the stock market. Before the stock market crash, these pension funds were flush with cash. But now, because of those two factors, underfunding and the Wall Street breakdown, there are shortfalls. These shortfalls are manageable. These shortfalls are in total about $46 billion a year. And we know they're manageable because states are now spending $80 billion a year, according to the New York Times, on subsidies to corporations. So it's not like states don't have the money to replenish these pension shortfalls. But what's going on is you have conservative activists, ideologues, going into states saying, we have this shortfall that was created by Wall Street shenanigans and states underfunding these pensions, and we should now, because of these shortfalls, we shouldn't cut back on the corporate subsidies. We shouldn't reduce all those tax cuts that we used the money to pay for in the past. We should now cut the retirement benefits. So they're actually citing the problem they created in order to make the problem even worse for retirees.
I thought it was really interesting that you start off the story talking about the fact that the Pew Foundation, first of all, said this is the problem, that the elderly are not going to have any golden years, and that this promise that was made to them if they were going to be working for the government, that they'll take less salary and they'll take more support, more security in the pension, that's a trade-off that will no longer even be relevant in a matter of 5 to 10 years. They know there's a problem, Pew, but nevertheless they reached this bond with the Arnold Foundation. Tell us about the Arnold Foundation, and tell us what Arnold is up to as far as trying to promote this idea that we must do away with people's pension programs.
Yeah, look, John Arnold is an Enron billionaire. That's where he made his money. He has funded the Arnold Foundation, which is working with the Pew Foundation to essentially launder his ideological agenda, make it look like it's pragmatic, academic, centrist, but it is a radical agenda. What he wants to do is apply the economics of Enron to people's pension plans. He comes out of a world that lives under the idea that it's every person for themselves. Every person can be a speculator and make lots of money in their 401k if they just invest it properly. It's not true. We've learned that from the stock market collapse. We've learned it from Enron. When it's collapsed, harmed, guess what? Public pensions. But John Arnold is basically using the Pew Foundation to make his agenda seem like it's the only agenda. And it's not the only path forward.
Why would Pew jump behind such an idea? First of all, I start from the position that Pew really does a credible job most of the time. That Pew, when you take a look at their numbers, you take a look at their research, it usually is not ridiculously ideologically driven. And it's a shock to me that Pew has said, yeah, we want to jump into the same program that Arnold's jumping into and convince states like California and Florida and Rhode Island and Arizona that, gee, you know, you really need to do away with your pension programs or you're going to go bankrupt because you have to give corporations subsidies or they're going to leave the state. That's kind of the pitch, isn't it?
That is the pitch. That's absolutely the pitch. Instead of getting rid of those corporate subsidies, Pew and Arnold are coming in and saying the budget shortfalls mean we need to cut guaranteed retirement income. Why is Pew involved in this? I think it's a good question. Look, Pew, I agree. A lot of its research in the last few decades has been genuinely pragmatic, centrist, and academic. It is a right-wing. It has right-wing roots. The roots of the Pew Foundation are right-wing. But I would say this to answer your question directly. The question is, what kind of financial relationship does John Arnold have with the Pew Foundation? The Pew Foundation has asked for well-resourced partnerships, well-resourced partners. The question is, did John Arnold essentially buy this branch of Pew for his own, for what he wants to do? We don't know that yet, but it certainly looks like this. He's certainly throwing around his money to all sorts of front groups and foundations to try to get his way.
Well, certainly this mythology is already taking place. It's taken hold. When you start hearing the austerity argument, it's always the government workers that have to suffer the most from it. It's never the corporation that rarely, and this is very interesting. When you look at the numbers of what corporate subsidies actually bring to a community, it very seldom even pays off, much less makes a profit. But the idea is if we give these corporations a subsidy, they're going to come here and they're going to prosper. Now, there's another part of that. The part is the people living in that community still have to make enough money for the entire community to prosper, for that entire local community or state community to be able to do well. And that part of the argument is never told. I see Rhode Island slashed their guaranteed pensions by about $75 million, according to your article, to retired. And instead, excuse me, let me phrase it this way. They slashed their money for retirement and took at least $75 million of that money and put it towards building a baseball field. We see that not just in Rhode Island. We see that's a trend we see happening throughout the country.
Everywhere. Yeah, that's right. And Rhode Island is a very good example of what happened. Rhode Island cut its cost of living increases to its pension funds, public workers, by $2.3 billion and used $2.1 billion of that recovered money to pay fees for the new hedge fund managers that are now managing some of those private accounts. At the same time, as you allude to, the state is spending $300 million a year total on corporate welfare subsidies, including that headline-grabbing subsidy to former Red Sox pitcher Curt Schilling. It is a complete bait and switch. And I want to make one last point because you're right to touch on it. The corporate subsidies that states are spending often are wasted. They do not create jobs. What we do know is that when states fully fund their pensions, when you put money into the hands of retirees who are making $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 on their retirement benefits, that's actually far more reliable local economic stimulus than handing over $75 million to Curt Schilling's failed video game company.
Yeah. So as we look at this story, I'd like to say that Rhode Island was just one example. But the truth is, you see it in your list is incredible. Detroit, Kansas, Florida. I mean, it's happening all over the country. We have the governor of every state actually trying to convince the citizens of the state that it's some kind of welfare to pay these government workers that have put in 30 years into this one job, low wages all the time, and it's corporate, and it's welfare, and at the same time, the real welfare is to the corporate entities that are right there in the backyard, that if you simply cut that corporate welfare, there's more than enough to pay
More
for
than
these
enough.
pensions, isn't there?
No, absolutely. Again, the number is Pew cites a $1.38 trillion 30-year pension shortfall. That's the collective number. That's $46 billion a year. The New York Times reports that states and cities are spending $80 billion a year on subsidies to firms. So you don't even have to get rid of all those subsidies. You could get rid of some of those subsidies to make the pension systems whole. And the politicians aren't talking about that. Now, why aren't they talking about that? Because, of course, the beneficiaries of the corporate subsidies just so happen to be some of the politicians' biggest campaign contributors.
Yeah, the New York Times, as you point out in your article, said that we're losing $80 billion every year that communities are giving to companies because that revenue that the company is supposed to generate is actually eaten up so many other ways, right?
Absolutely. Again, you have all sorts of evidence that these subsidies do not create jobs, do not create public revenues. They are complete giveaways. And I just hope that everybody who's watching this understands the next time you see a politician in your state plead poverty to justify cuts to guaranteed retirement income for public employees, you should go to the New York Times website, look up your state. Look up how much your state is spending each year on subsidies to already wealthy mega corporations, and then ask yourself, why is the politician telling me that the state is out of money? Clearly, the states are not out of money. What they're really saying is we are choosing to use money that we are supposed to be paying to retirees. We are choosing to use that money to hand it over to our big campaign contributors.
Yeah, and when they see those numbers, they're going to have to fight their gag reflex, aren't they?
Absolutely.
David Sirota,
it's really grotesque.
thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Coming up, we'll find out how cuts to higher education are devastating our state economies. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Budget cuts have forced states to cut back on their funding of public colleges, but they've done this without realizing the consequences, which is typical for Republicans. I have TV and radio host David Pakman with me now to tell us what happens to state economies when college funding dries up. David, there's so many ways that the austerity plan is killing this economy, but one of the nuances that I don't know why we miss. I mean, I don't know you and I miss it, but certainly I think the rest of the media seems to miss it. And that is that the higher education is such an integral part of a vibrant economy. And it seems like right now that discussion is not even on the table, and the cuts are startling, what they're cutting out of higher education. What's your take?
Yeah, it creates this vicious circle that I think a lot of particularly right-wingers understand kind of stimulative effect of different types of spending just are totally missing. So federal funding goes down to states for education. They start spending less per student. There's problems with keeping enough teachers on staff. Education gets worse. Test results get worse. Less students go to college. Less college education means lower wages overall, which interestingly enough, in the end, actually means that there are less tax revenues and even less money to put into education. So the idea that we should be giving corporate tax cuts and tax cuts for the rich instead of funding education at the federal level just is not even a fiscally conservative idea.
Well, the other part of it, isn't it part of it that rather than giving corporations subsidies in thinking, okay, these subsidies are going to bring jobs, they're going to bring a corporation to our backyard, the studies show just the opposite. The studies show that this money that they're pumping into subsidies doesn't really doesn't have that kind of effect that they always want to brag about. So the answer seems simple here. The answer is take some of those corporate subsidies away. Say to that corporation, you know, you want to come to town, you want to do business, that's great. We're not going to be able to give you as much of a subsidy, but what we're going to offer you is a very educated public that can help your company. Isn't that the better talking point?
It absolutely is, and I just was looking at some numbers last week on my show comparing the stimulative effect of different types of federal spending. At the very bottom of the list are tax cuts for the rich and corporate tax cuts. At the top of the list are food stamps, unemployment insurance, as well as infrastructure spending and education. And it's very obvious why that is, because those types of spending are either providing money that is immediately spent and put back into the economy, like unemployment benefits and food stamps, or they are real investments in the country, like education. Whereas, as you said, corporate tax cuts and tax cuts for the rich, they don't create investment, but they actually slow down the velocity of money. Most of that money is just put in the bank.
Isn't part of the problem, David, that you have the corporations have the lobbyists, the people with the money, the people with the gold make the rules. The people that are the victims here, that are the students, they're the parents of the students, the university folks, they're the people that trying to educate our children. They don't have lobbyists that show up in Washington, D.C. They don't even have lobbyists to go to the state capitol and say, how dare you cut 50% of our budget? What are the numbers looking like? I'm hearing as high as 50, some places 70% cuts to higher education.
That's right. The numbers are that high. It's the states simply cannot just make it up in this kind of vacuum situation. You either have to reduce the number of teachers, spend less per student, raise the money elsewhere, take money from somewhere else. And what's amazing is you're making a good point, which is the corporations have lobbyists and the teachers and schools don't. However, you hear so much more criticism of unions, teachers' unions, which comparatively have very little power, and very little criticism of the entire lobbyist industrial complex that exists. It makes no sense at all.
Well, as this goes forward, if you're an employer, the employer certainly wants to attract employees that have the fundamental education to be able to write, to be able to think in different concepts, to be able to think abstractly, different cultures, different ideas, to be able to move into a tech world that's moving so fast that it'll make your head spin. And why does somebody say, I want to go to Podunk, Florida, when we have the governor of that state, Rick Scott, cutting the budget as high as 60% for the state universities, and then also saying to corporate America, while we're cutting that budget, we want to give you more tax breaks. We want to give you more subsidies in order to come here. I mean, I don't understand the connection there. Do you?
No, I don't. And the other element here is that you also have to throw in the cost of those college educations, which is kind of the X factor here, which is we're reducing funding, federal funding at the state level, and then the cost of college keeps going up whether or not federal funding increases. And now you actually have a situation we also have to consider. I was just doing research for my show today. 1 year here in New York City, 1 year of housing an inmate in jail costs more than 4 years tuition at Harvard. And this is kind of the next layer, right? Which is we don't even have the right focus. A lot of nonviolent drug offenders are just sitting around in jails. And this is all really part of the same thing. The jailing of nonviolent drug offenders, the underfunding of public education, it's all perpetuating the same vicious cycle.
Well, okay, let's look at it this way. If you have an educated public, what that does is it adds to the tax base. As you point out, putting somebody in prison doesn't add a dime to the tax base. And if you add to that you have a college-educated individual coming out of college, they owe $28,000, $30,000 just when they step out the door, they're unemployed. What does that do to the housing market, which is one of the most fundamental drivers of any local or national economy? I mean, you see the connections here, right?
There's not only that, there's the point I started with, which is it's widely demonstrated that when you have a higher percentage of the population in a city or state with a college education, the average salaries are higher, and therefore, like you said, the tax base goes up and more money is actually collected without having to raise rates, which is presumably what right-wingers want to avoid doing. So you would think they would understand that and they would want to fund education for that reason.
Well, one thing we used to have is we had a setting where individuals from all over the world would come to the United States because they wanted a great education. I think of UNC Chapel Hill. That's where my daughter goes to school. what an incredible, incredible institution. But part of it is driven because they have the research triangle there. The research triangle turns out medicine, it turns out technical elements of science, it turns out business elements of science. It is a true research developed area. Now, when they cut the funding at UNC, what that does is it causes professors to go somewhere else. They're going to go where they can get paid the most money because they don't pay professors a lot to begin with. So you take these great professors that are building these institutions there locally, that are attracting these multinational conglomerates to come in and do business at UNC, and all of a sudden the professor's gone. What else happens in the process?
Well, the other element that you're also missing there is that then a lot of these fields where we're losing the good professors, they're incredibly expensive as a result of all of the issues we've discussed regarding student loans, etc. The last element to this that I see that we haven't yet touched on is education itself starts to be criticized as a liberal indoctrination. And we heard this from Rick Santorum. We heard this going into the primaries in 2012. The idea itself that wanting to go to college and wanting to go to good colleges is in some way part of the so-called liberal plan to indoctrinate. And that's kind of like the X factor that's coming into all of this, which is part of why people aren't more outraged at the education cuts that we're seeing.
Aren't we going to see a competition at some time in the United States? You're going to start seeing the leadership is going to see the connection. You're going to have somebody that goes to a place like UNC Chapel Hill. They say, you know, we would like to have our research triangle in North Dakota, for example. I looked at these states, for example. North Dakota didn't cut their higher education budget. They increased it. And isn't the message here to leadership in those state houses, you're doing this not just to that college, you're not just hurting UNC, you're hurting the entire economy around UNC by losing that research triangle.
That's exactly right. And part of this is if you have a 2-year term or a 4-year term or whatever the case may be, and a lot of the benefits of increasing funding for education, you won't really see them until you've got a couple of cycles of students having come and gone and gotten their first and second jobs. It's too far out to be politically advantageous. Why do that when there's no benefit to your reelection in 2 years, when you can spend the money on something else that will reap immediate benefits?
Well, let me ask you, do you see the split? You mentioned earlier that it is one of the right-wing, really neo-nut talking points that higher education is hurting us all because they're pumping crazy ideas into the heads of students. Now, the extreme of that is Texas, where you have in Texas, in the high school level and now moving into college level, they're saying critical thinking is not that important. We really shouldn't focus on critical thinking. We should teach them how to count, how to spell, and how to write. And if we do that, that's all that's really necessary in perpetuating a good, solid education infrastructure. What's your take on that?
Yeah, we've seen the kind of literally the rewriting of Texas textbooks. We've seen this exclusion of critical thinking, and we're starting to get increasing divergence of how prepared students are when they go into the real world. And you talked about some states increasing funding for education. I've spoken to education experts who say there are students coming from a lot of these schools that teach creationism. They teach all sorts of different curriculum, and they're using these new textbooks that have been rewritten, and they're just unprepared. They are already behind on day one before anything has been assigned. We haven't read a page yet. They are already behind, and that is going to start being reflected as well in the workforce.
David, it's important that our lawyers have a good fundamental background. I remember last year interviewing a couple of lawyers from Ivy League schools, by the way, and I would ask them about, let's talk about a Steinbeck novel. Let's talk about Hemingway. Let's talk about Joseph Conrad. What do you think about the themes to those great ideas? And they seemed wholly incapable of doing that because it's become a need-to-know education. Have you seen that?
Absolutely, no question about it. There's kind of this, broadly speaking, well-rounded education where, regardless of specifically whether you're working in law or chemistry or philosophy, that seems to be suffering right now. And there's just a lack of, and I don't blame individuals, right? Because if you consider what you're being fed from corporate news media, the average curriculum in so many different states, including Texas, you can't just come up with that curiosity on your own. So it's not at all the fault of, I would argue it's not the fault of those lawyers you interviewed specifically. It's more of a systemic issue.
I guess I'm a little more judgmental on that, but I think you are right. It is systemic. David Pakman, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll find out why Democrats haven't been successful in recruiting younger politicians. I'm Mike Papantonio. You're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. The Democratic Party is beginning to suffer from a severe lack of young leadership. As Republicans recruit more and more youthful candidates, they could start taking away a huge chunk of millennial voters. Joining me now to talk about this problem is Farron Cousins, executive editor of the Trial Lawyer magazine. Farron, doesn't the Democratic Party have the same problem the Republicans have where it comes to moving new blood through their ranks? Might even be worse with the Democrats. What's your take?
I do believe it's worse with the Democrats. The Republicans have actually done a pretty good job of trying to recruit these younger people. Marco Rubio, Paul Ryan, Rand Paul, they're all in their early 40s. Whereas, the best hope for the Democratic Party, according to party leaders, is Hillary Clinton, who by this next election cycle is going to be 69 years old. And we're not bringing in the new blood that the Republicans are. Now, there's some debate whether or not that's actually going to attract the younger generation of voters, but it does represent a very real problem for the Democratic Party. We have these Clinton holdovers that have been sitting in office, for more than 20 years. They've become complacent. They've lost the fight, they've lost that spirit, and a lot of them have lost the drive to fight back against the Republicans. We've got a few out there. We've got the Elizabeth Warrens, the Bernie Sanders, Sheldon Whitehouse, and Alan Grayson, but those people are too few and far between. And again, no offense to them at all, but they are getting up there in age, and a national, presidential election is not in their future.
Haven't we seen the problem with Harry Reid? I mean, there's some times where he's in front of the camera and you want to put a mirror under his nose to see if there's condensation that might show up on the mirror. And you go, wow, this is leadership. There's nobody, in other words, there's nobody in the lower ranks that could do a better job. It's almost an arrogance it's going to kill the Democrats if they don't get over it.
It is. And again, it does go back to that complacency. We're perfectly happy with Hillary Clinton. We're happy with Harry Reid. We're not, but the party in general is. We think that longevity is the same as greatness. And as we've seen, especially with Harry Reid, it is not. I mean, just from a simple psychological standpoint, we know that as people age, as they get older, they do lose the ability to, see things in black and white, good versus bad. They start to see things more in the middle. Some of it just comes down to just pure energy, doesn't it? I mean, it does. Just to put it to put the easiest point to it, some of it just comes down to energy, and the energy to confront the fights that the Democrats are having to fight with the Republicans. It seems like the Democrats need to really abandon what they're doing. Now, the other part of it to me is they seem to be, even the young Democrats they're attracting are just like the same old mouthpiece. Cory Booker. Yeah, Cory is 44. But if you listen to Cory Booker, he sounds just like Bill Clinton, sounds just like Hillary Clinton. And when you really drill down on the problems there,
new ideas is what keeps a party vibrant. It keeps the party moving ahead. That's what's happening to the Republican Party. They've simply, they're fallen into an abyss of old, white, frail, male, stale ideas that simply they can't resurrect even with this effort to put in newer, younger politicians. What's your thought?
Well, the Democrats are not looking at the long game situation. They're looking at the next 2016 election, but they have no plans beyond that. Republicans, on the other hand, they do have these young, unpolished, very extreme people, again with Rubio and Cruz and Rand Paul, but these people are young enough to where in 10 years from now, 15 years from now, they're still going to be in their late, maybe middle 50s, and they will have matured. They're not going to hold on to these extremist views. I don't believe they will. They're going to see the public opinion change. They're already seeing public opinion change, and they adapt to it, and they're young enough to adapt. We don't have that as a Democratic Party. We have people that are old. They're set in their ways. I mean,
why are we still talking about Hillary Clinton, for example? I mean, she's, what is she, 70? She's nearly 70 years old. We have all these young stars coming up. You've got Brian Schweitzer, he's what, 57, Elizabeth Warren, 60s, Sherrod Brown, 60, Mark Warner, 58. You've got some people that at least aren't, they're not at that 70 mark, and they can become a leader for a good while. It's like Bill Clinton is still out there in the leadership role. I wish he wasn't, but he is still out there in this leadership role because he was a young enough man when he was elected president. That's part of that leadership chain that needs to follow any political party, isn't it?
Well, you see, there is this big fight in the Democratic Party. We do not have this same massive billionaire donor base that the Republicans do. We don't have guys like the Koch brothers who just two guys who could spend hundreds of millions of dollars for a single campaign.
Well, wait,
so
we do have it, but they're not willing to spend that kind of money.
Right,
Let's make a distinction here. They are there. First of all, again, disclosure, I'm not a Democrat, but the Democrats have big money. It's the question if they're not willing to do what the Koch brothers are doing. But go ahead.
Well, see, Hillary Clinton, though, kind of has a monopoly on those guys. She's been around so long, she knows all the people, and that's the distinction that comes in between the young up-and-comers in the party and the old guard. They know these people. They've been working with them and essentially doing their bidding for 20, 25 years.
Farron,
they can't risk the gamble.
Isn't part of it what you're describing is what I call the Wall Street Democrat, the Wall Streeters, the Robert Rubin types that have put the Clintons, for example, in power and Obama in power. You're saying there's no room for new people to move into that space in about 15 seconds. What's your take?
These massive donors don't want to jump ship in the middle of, we're already in the middle of the 2016 campaign season. Don't think that we're not. And they know Hillary Clinton is the horse that they think is most likely to win.
Farron Cousins, thanks. Let's hope the Democrats wake up before it's too late.
Thank you.
In order for the progressive movement to survive, we have to keep the young generation of Americans politically and socially active. But that's no small task. I'm joined now by radio host Richard Fowler to tell us how we can train a new generation of young activists. Richard, it seems like the political party that gets young people involved has the best chance for sustainability. Farron Cousins is a big critic of the Democrats in that he says, first of all, it's an old, aging party that still feels like the only people they can go to are people like Hillary Clinton when we've got a lot of great young politicians that are overlooked. How do you get young people involved in the active participation of politics to begin with? You work in this area all the time.
Oh, I think you're completely right, Pap. And I think some of the work we do here at the Generational Alliance is just that of how you get young people involved in the political process. And the best way to do that, Pap, is engaging them in issues that affect their daily lives. We have great groups that do that. We have 22 different national organizations that we partner with, and we sort of the convener of this space. And we have some groups that are working on reproductive rights. We have groups that are working with LGBTQ families on LGBTQ equality. And we have groups that sort of are really in the weeds, talking to young people each and every day and engaging them on the issues that face them.
Do you think it's a bad rap where they group Generation Xers with millennials and say that neither group has been politically active enough? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I got to tell you, I don't know what statistics people are looking at, but you talk to some of the young people that we work with every day here at the Gen Alliance, and you know that our generation is not only active, but we're empowered to truly and fundamentally change this country from the grassroots up. Like I tell folks all the time, Pat, we've got to stop leading from behind. And I think our generation gets that. And when they group us together with other generations, they do us a real disservice. We showed up for the president in 2008. We showed up for the president again in 2012. And I got to tell you, with the fact that we're in the middle, with the fact that we had a government shutdown, and with the fact what we've seen from this Republican Congress, we will stand up once again on progressive issues.
Richard, one thing I see that I am sold on, because I'm seeing it firsthand, is that the millennials are they're more likely to get involved in a political action group such as the ones you've described, as opposed to getting involved with a political party, because they don't have a lot of trust for either political party at this point. They've become cynical about politics where it comes to political parties, but they're still willing to get out there and get involved in issues like, as you point out, maybe civil rights, economic rights, health rights. They're willing to do that. What do you make of that split? Are you seeing it in your role?
I think you're definitely seeing it here at the Gen Alliance and our 22 partners, because our partners work on issue-specific things. For example, United We Dream, which is an organization of young people that have rallied around the ideal of comprehensive immigration reform. So they're not really beholden to one party or another. They're beholden to a legislative victory and what it takes to get that legislative victory. And they are doing everything in their power to stop the 1,100 daily deportations that happen every day, because they understand these are their family members, these are their cousins, these are their friends, their neighbors, their classmates. And I think that is why millennials are getting engaged. We're one of the most diverse generations. And beyond the fact that we're one of the most diverse generations, we're the generation that is going to be sort of stuck with all the bad goods that, previous Congresses put out there. So they are pushing on action issues and not necessarily pushing on a particular party, because they understand that we have to get these issues through in order for us to have real justice and real fairness and real equality and real job opportunities for our generation.
What is it that you think is all the polls are showing that there's this feeling, almost this offensive nature that the way they regard political parties? What's that about?
Well, I think that has everything to do with, we've seen our leaders in Washington sort of lead us astray, whether it's one party or the other. They've shut down the government. They've downgraded our credit. They won't fix a student loan debt crisis. We can't get them to agree on immigration. We can't get them to agree on reproductive rights for women. We can't get them to agree on marriage equality and issues for LGBTQ families. So if we can't get them to agree on things, why engage?
Well, we know that part of the problem, I'd say, if I were to assess a value, I would say 70% of that problem is driven by insane neo-nut Republicans. The public doesn't get the distinction, though, and I don't think young people get the distinction, that it's not the Democrats that are being obstructionists. But on the Democratic Party, the theme that comes through all the time is Obama failed us, and then they'll always start off, Obama failed us on Wall Street. That Obama has this allegiance to Wall Street. And it's amazing to me that they get that they understand that this administration has totally failed where it comes to reining in Wall Street. What's your take?
Well, I think you're completely right. And I think if we have organizations, one of our organizations particularly that comes to mind when you talk about Wall Street is the United States Student Association, and the work they do around regulating Wall Street, regulating Sallie Mae as the student loan debt crisis continues to mount and mount and mount. We've talked about this before on the show. I've talked about this before with you, Pat, about the student loan debt crisis. And I think you're right. Don't get me wrong. I think what we know from young people is they understand that there are progressives, members of Congress that are standing up for their issues. And they also understand that there are conservative extremists, which will do everything in their power to destroy middle class and working class families. And we are adamantly against those extremists. But at the same time, we need our voices to be heard, and we need our issues to be put at the forefront. And that's some of the work we do here at the Alliance, whether it's building youth media arsenal, so we're sort of engaging in the media space more, or it's engaging on the ground, knocking on doors. We're fully ramped up here. We're ready to go to make sure that we get the change we need.
And I'm glad you're doing that. I think you do have an impact. Richard Fowler, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Pat.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll see you next week right here on the Ring of Fire.